Today, we take a step behind the curtain into the quietly powerful corridors of Western policy and advocacy groups that appear to have very loud voices when it comes to Arabs and Muslims. These institutions often dress themselves in the robes of respectability, freedom, security, democracy, and yet beneath that veneer, one finds a systematic alignment in favor of one side of a historic conflict, the State of Israel and its policies. We'll look at how some think tanks and advocacy groups, and I don't mean the AIPACs or the ADLs, who we know and recognize so well, but whose names suggest impartiality and moral virtue, who function as actors in a broader pro-Israel narrative, and importantly, how this shapes discourse about Arabs in general, Muslims, Palestinians, and you, the viewer's ability to clearly see the facts on the ground. Before we dive into specific groups, let's define what we're talking about. When an organization claims to be a nonpartisan, policy-oriented for liberty, but repeatedly advances arguments that align with Israeli policy, or frames Palestinian or Arab actors as extremist or morally inferior, then we must ask, is this genuine policy analysis, or is it advocacy and hasbara in disguise? One piece of scholarship that I highly recommend and want to highlight is the Israeli lobby, where it is argued that the lobby strives to ensure that public discourse portrays Israel in a positive light. The goal is to prevent critical comments from getting a fair hearing in the political arena. Also, how in mainstream discourse, American support for Israel is a political religion.
I came into Congress 13 years ago with the stated intention of being the leading defender of Israel in the United States Senate.
Great.
And I've worked every day to do that.
So the problem is when analysis becomes advocacy. Dissent and nuance vanish. For Arab and Muslim American communities, this matters deeply. A report by the United States Commission on Civil Rights found that profiling, stereotyping, and discrimination of Arab and Muslim Americans remains widespread. And for Arabs and Muslims beyond, its impact is much worse. Thus, what is faced is not a foreign policy issue, but one of social justice, representation, and truth-telling. Now, let's turn to a concrete case, the Heritage Foundation. Sounds innocent, right? On its surface, a conservative public policy think tank dedicated to America's founding principles. But if you look deeper, you find a consistent and very explicit alignment with Israeli state interests. Some key examples are how in a policy document titled Israel Solutions 2024, the Heritage Foundation states Israel is the Middle East's only genuine democracy and shares important values and interests with the United States. It goes on to propose, support Israel's efforts to deter and defend against threats from Iran. The principal barriers to peace are Palestinian terrorist attacks, not Israeli settlements. That's a remarkable framing. Settlements, occupation, blockade, all recast as secondary issues, with Palestinian terrorism cast as primary. In its Israel relations as Israel approaches its centenary, the Foundation recommends the United States expand foreign military financing for Israel. The United States should transition Israel from a military financing recipient to a security partner. In short, the Heritage Foundation advocates not just for soft policy, but for increased arms and strategic cooperation. The Foundation's Project Esther, launched October 2024, frames the United States' pro-Palestinian movement as America's virility anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-American pro-Palestinian movement, part of a global Hamas support network. In effect, whoever is critical of Israel is in fact part of a terrorist support network. So why does this matter? Well, rather than presenting a balanced Middle East policy portfolio, we find a consistent narrative. Israel is the democracy, the partner. Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims alike are framed as threats. The language of only democracy, threats from Iran and radical Islam, terrorist networks saturates the analysis. And hence, this has real-world impact. When a major think tank sets the terms of debate, media pick it up. Policymakers reference it. Academic discussion follows. The effect is that alternative narratives, Arab voices, are marginalized. Beyond the Heritage Foundation, a constellation of think tanks and advocacy groups, American and European, quietly harmonize in defending Israel's narrative while dressing their work in the language of liberty, democracy, and security. In the United States, we have the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Founded after 9/11, the FDD markets itself as nonpartisan, yet its publications almost uniformly back Israeli military policy and frame Arab resistance as terrorism. Senior fellow Jonathan Schanzer once wrote that Israel fights wars of necessity, Hamas fights wars of choice. Such binary morality leaves no room for occupation, only defense. Another such group is the AIPAC offshoot, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Sounds fairly non-biased, right? Well, WINEP's policy papers repeatedly argue that the United States' interests align naturally with Israel's. Former executive director Robert Satloff claimed, Israel is a stabilizing force in an unstable region. By equating Israeli power with stability, WINEP recasts Palestinian resistance as disorder and chaos. The American Enterprise Institute champions itself as a beacon of free enterprise and American leadership. Yet its Middle East fellows, such as Michael Rubin and Daniel Pletka, have repeatedly equated Palestinian governance with terrorism and dismissed Arab critiques of Israel as anti-Western propaganda. In a 2021 piece, Pletka argued, Israel remains a moral and strategic ally, surrounded by regimes that reject peace. The phrasing erases the context of occupation and recasts the entire Arab world as irrational aggressors. A familiar rhetorical sleight of hand. AEI's panels frequently advocate unconditional military aid to Israel while opposing U.S. engagement with Arab civil society movements, citing regional stability. The Hudson Institute brands itself as a hub for American leadership and global security, but its Middle East programming routinely mirrors Israeli government talking points. Senior fellow Michael Doran described the Gaza protests as a Hamas propaganda operation and praised Israeli restraint even amid civilian casualties. Hudson's reports often argue that U.S.-Israel ties are central to defeating radical Islam and containing Iran, a framing that blends anti-Muslim suspicion with strategic justification. Through polished white papers and congressional testimonies, Hudson repackages advocacy as expertise, the oldest trick in the think tank playbook. In Europe, ELNET, the European Leadership Network, described by many as AIPAC for Europe, builds strategic dialogues between EU states and Israel. Its site speaks of shared democratic values, yet its mission centers on countering criticism of Israel within European politics, a subtle diplomatic firewall around Tel Aviv. The European Coalition for Israel, operating out of Brussels, presents itself as a Christian democratic defender of Israel, urging the EU to help Israel defeat Hamas. Beneath the script of faith and freedom lies a consistent campaign to silence pro-Palestinian advocacy in European institutions. And here we see a pattern across continents. The method is the same. Wrap advocacy in virtue, call loyalty security, frame dissent as extremism. These institutions, who are but a few on a long list of pro-Zionist groups relentlessly working behind the scenes, rarely speak of ethnic cleansing, displacement, or siege, only of shared values, threats, and terror. Together, they form a quiet chorus, we can say, and an orchestra of influence, ensuring that one narrative sings loudest, while the Arab and Palestinian story is barely heard. So, how do we know what they really stand for? They'll tell you they defend democracy. They'll say they fight extremism, protect liberty, and promote peace. The words shimmer like glass, transparent, harmless. But if you tilt that glass just right, if you let the light hit it sideways, the truth appears in the reflection. Look first at who funds them. Money leaves fingerprints. The same corporate donors who profit from defense contracts, or the political patrons tied to foreign lobbies, and even the Christian Zionists, they rarely invest in neutrality. Their grants come with invisible strings, pulling the narrative towards the familiar anthem: Israel as the bastion of light, their world as its surrounding darkness. Beyond the funding and to discover their true intentions, listen closely to their silences. The omissions speak louder than the speeches. A policy brief that weeps for rockets and not for blockades, a report that mourns security threats but forgets the bulldozed homes of refugees. You begin to hear it, the music of selective empathy.
The United Nations itself has in many ways become the saboteurs of many things that we're trying to do, and actually they've sort of become the press secretaries for a lot of Hamas disinformation that has been laundered through the United Nations.
Right. Open a report. Watch the sentences parade across the page. Feel the confident authority of each paragraph and then ask, what isn't there? The Heritage Foundation talks about Palestinian terrorist attacks as though they are the only force shaping the region. What they rarely whisper is the story of kidnapped Palestinian children, of families uprooted, of the slow choke of a blockade in Gaza. The names of settlements, the numbers of displaced, these are absent, invisible in the narrative they choose to tell. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies counts missiles and rockets, highlights plots and threats, but the hospitals without electricity, the children without clean water, the voices silenced under checkpoints, those details are missing, left in the shadows. WINEP will remind you of Iran's ambitions, of Hamas's acts, of the perils of radicalism. But US policy itself, the aid that arms occupation, the vetoes that prevent international accountability, rarely makes the page. The script is neat. Israel defends, America supports, the rest are all dangers. And across the Atlantic, ELNET and its European companions focus on anti-Israel sentiment in parliaments, in classrooms, in social media. What is left out is often the most important. The criticism grounded in human rights reports, the voices of Palestinians living under occupation, the legal and moral questions of the IDF's actions. Silence becomes advocacy. Absence becomes bias. So the lesson is subtle but urgent. The story they tell is only one half of the world. The other half, the half of human suffering, of political complexity, of moral ambiguity, is often omitted, quietly erased. And if we accept only the story that's offered, we're seeing a curated reality, one designed to lead the mind in a very particular direction. To watch, to listen, to question, not just what is said, but what is missing. This is how we begin to glimpse the truth beneath the polished veneer. Now ask who repeats their words. Watch the chain of the echo. The think tank's report appears in a news column. The column shapes a senator's talking point. The talking point becomes foreign policy. It's not coincidence, it's choreography. And once you see the steps, you can't unsee them. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies routinely appears in congressional testimony and influences many political channels. For example, during a House committee meeting, FDD's senior vice president, Jonathan Schanzer, gave testimony explicitly naming American Muslims for Palestine and the Students for Justice in Palestine as rooted in Hamas-linked funding. The Heritage Foundation's policy reports are shown to influence high-level governmental documentation. A defense strategy memo from the United States' Department of Defense was found to closely parallel a Heritage report, raising concerns about policy being guided by the think tank's framing. The European lobby group ELNET publishes surveys and produces dialogues that are cited by European parliamentarians to back pro-Israel policy narratives. One of their surveys claims 83% of European parliamentarians believe Israel holds a special relationship with their country. ELNET was also directly involved in briefing European parliamentarians and assisting legislative initiatives on terrorism and funds not reaching terrorists. The language of their report is adopted into EU documents. In short, what these think tanks say gets reused by policymakers, reflected in institutional documents, echoed in media, and becomes part of the conventional frame. Recognizing this chain helps you pinpoint how influence works, not only the message, but who repeats it and where it shows up. So, how do we call them out? Not with rage. That only feeds their narrative of irrational anger. We call them out with calm precision, with evidence. Quote their own reports. Read their footnotes aloud. Ask the questions they avoid. Why does your analysis never mention occupation? Why is every Arab government described through the lens of instability? Why is every act of resistance reduced to terror? Expose the pattern, not the person. Reveal the architecture, not the facade. Because the goal isn't to destroy these institutions. It's to strip away the illusion of moral innocence that shields them. To remind the public that policy language can be as manipulative as propaganda, only quieter. When you show their biases in their own words, when you match the polish of their rhetoric with the clarity of truth, they lose their powers to masquerade as impartial. And perhaps in that moment, the audience will see what you see. That beneath the marble floors and polished statements, these think tanks and advocacy groups are not mirrors of reason. They are projectors of ideology. And once this light fades, their image fades with it.